This happened to me in the summer of 2001. My name is Paul. I was 31 that summer and going through a divorce I had not seen coming. My friend Renee had known me since high school, and after 3 weekends of finding excuses not to leave my apartment, she showed up at my door with 2 fishing rods, a cooler, and a folded map of a national forest about 3 hours north. "You're not spending another weekend staring at the wall," she said. "We're going to the lake." Renee was the organized one. She had printed directions from the ranger station, our permit sealed in a plastic sleeve, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and enough food for 4 days. We had been camping together since college, so neither of us was inexperienced. We knew how to read trail maps, judge weather, and more importantly, when not to take unnecessary chances. My dog Scout came with us too. She was a 5-year-old shepherd mix, sturdy and calm, the kind of dog that barked at squirrels but otherwise minded her own business. I'd never seen her genuinely frightened of anything. We drove Renee's old Bronco deep into the forest that Friday afternoon. Pavement became gravel, gravel became dirt, and eventually we passed a closed bait shop with an old payphone mounted outside. Renee pointed at it as we passed. "Remember that. Last phone we're going to see." About 20 minutes later, we reached Site 14, a primitive campsite beside a wide river. The nearest occupied site was almost half a mile away. About 200 yards upriver was an old wooden footbridge connecting our side of the river to a logging trail on the opposite bank. Renee had already marked the bridge on our map because we planned to hike that trail the following day. The campsite was better than I expected. Tall pines surrounded a flat patch of ground with a stone fire ring, and through the trees, we had a clear view of the water. We arrived around 5 and had everything set up well before dark. Scout spent an hour investigating the edge of the site before settling beside my chair. That first night was exactly what Renee had promised me I needed. We ate canned chili, played an old mix CD on a battery-powered player, and talked by the fire until it burned low. For the first time in months, I stopped thinking about paperwork, lawyers, and an apartment that no longer felt like home. Around 9, Scout suddenly stood. There was no gradual reaction. 1 second she was lying beside me, and the next she was staring across the river. "What is it?" I asked. She did not look at me. Renee listened for a few seconds. "Probably a deer." Scout made a low sound in her throat. Not quite a growl, more like a warning she had not decided what to do with yet. I walked to the riverbank and swept my flashlight across the water. The beam reached the opposite shore and picked out tree trunks, brush, and part of the logging trail. Nothing moved. I listened for footsteps or branches breaking, but all I heard was water moving over rocks. Scout remained standing for almost 20 minutes. The next morning we crossed the footbridge and spent most of the day hiking. Nothing strange happened. We saw 2 hikers around noon and an older couple fishing farther upriver. By the time we returned to camp, I had convinced myself Scout had smelled some animal we could not see. That evening, we cooked dinner and sat beside the fire while the last light disappeared behind the trees. Renee got me talking about the divorce, something I had avoided most of the trip. She told me I had spent years adjusting my life around everyone else's expectations, and that this weekend was the first time in months she had seen me make a decision simply because I wanted to make it. I remember laughing and telling her she was getting sentimental. Then, a little after 10, a man screamed for help. The sound came from across the river. Renee and I stood so quickly our chairs scraped backward through the dirt. For several seconds, everything went quiet. Then the voice came again. "Help, please." It was distant enough that the water distorted it, but there was no mistaking it for an animal. It sounded like a grown man, and he sounded frightened. Scout backed toward the tent. That was the first thing that bothered me. She was not staring across the river anymore. Her ears flattened, and she moved directly into the path between Renee and the narrow trail leading upriver toward the footbridge. "Someone's hurt," Renee said. She grabbed her flashlight and first aid kit. I took my flashlight and called across the water. "We hear you. Where are you?" There was a pause. Then the man answered, "Upstream, near the rocks. I fell." His voice sounded strained. Renee started toward the bridge. Scout stepped in front of her. "Move, girl." Scout did not move. Renee tried going around her, and Scout turned sharply, blocking her again. Then she gave one hard bark. I had never seen her do that to either of us. "Scout." She looked at me and whined. Across the river, the man called again. "My leg. Please hurry." Renee stared into the darkness. She had volunteered with a search and rescue group during college, and I could see something about the situation bothering her. I asked, "What are you thinking?" Instead of answering, she said, "Ask what campsite he's at." I shouted across the water, "What site are you staying at?" The answer did not come immediately. When it finally did, the voice sounded weaker. "I don't know. I'm alone." Renee looked at me. I called again. "What trail did you come from?" Another long pause. "The river trail." Renee slowly lowered her flashlight. There was no trail officially called the river trail on our map. "If he's camping around here," she whispered, "he should know a site number, a trail marker, something." The voice called again, "Please hurry." Scout growled, but she was no longer looking toward the river. She was staring behind us. I turned and swept my flashlight across the campsite. The beam passed over our tent, the cooler, the fire, Renee's Bronco, and finally the trees behind everything. Nothing moved. I kept the light there. "Paul," Renee whispered. "Yeah." "Don't go toward that bridge." We shouted that we were going to get help. The man did not answer. That sudden silence bothered me more than the shouting had. Renee grabbed the map and keys while I got Scout into the Bronco. We left the tent and most of our equipment behind and drove toward the old payphone at the bait shop. The nearest ranger checkpoint was not staffed overnight, and the actual ranger station was much farther away, so the phone was our quickest chance of reaching somebody. Neither of us talked during the drive. Renee kept checking the mirror. When we reached the bait shop, I got out and lifted the receiver. Nothing. I pressed the switch several times. Still nothing. The phone was completely quiet. Renee stayed inside the Bronco with Scout and the doors locked. We could have driven toward the main ranger station, but the shortest forest road leading there was gated after dark. Going around would have taken well over an hour. We also did not want to return to Site 14 and sit there alone after what had happened. About a mile from our campsite was a cluster of primitive sites closer to the main dirt road. 2 were occupied by families with trailers. We pulled into an empty space beside them and explained enough to one of the men that he understood why we did not want to be alone. He had a CB radio in his truck but could not reach the ranger frequency. He told us to stay nearby until morning. Scout refused to get out of the Bronco. That settled it for me. We spent the night there. I probably slept for 20 minutes total. Every time headlights moved somewhere along the distant road, I sat up. Just after sunrise, we drove directly to the ranger checkpoint. A woman named Carol was unlocking the building when we arrived. She listened while Renee explained the voice. The strange answers, Scout blocking us from the bridge and then staring behind the campsite. Carol asked one question immediately. "Did either of you cross the river?" "No." "Did you go back to Site 14 after leaving?" "No." Her expression tightened slightly. She picked up her radio and asked another ranger to meet us at our campsite. The fact that she did that without laughing or suggesting we had heard another camper frightened me more than I expected. We followed their truck back to Site 14. From the dirt road, everything looked untouched. Our tent was still standing. The cooler was closed. The chairs were where we had left them. Even the fire ring looked exactly the same. Scout jumped out of the Bronco and went straight behind the tent. Her nose stayed close to the ground until she reached a patch of grass near the tree line. Then she stopped. One of the rangers crouched beside her. The grass had been pressed flat in a rough oval, not stepped on, flattened, as though someone had been sitting or kneeling in that exact place for a long time. Less than 30 feet from where Renee and I had been sitting beside the fire, the ranger found part of a boot print in the damp dirt. The toe pointed toward our tent. Renee did not say anything. Neither did I. The night before, while we had been listening to a voice somewhere across the river, somebody had been close enough to watch us without being seen. Carol and the other ranger began searching the surrounding area. Scout kept pulling toward the trees, but Carol asked me to hold her back so we would not disturb anything. About 20 minutes later, the second ranger called from upriver. We followed him toward the footbridge. He crossed first. On the opposite side, maybe 40 feet from the bridge, he had found a small handheld radio secured low against a tree trunk behind some brush. It had been wrapped partly in a dark plastic bag to keep it dry. Renee stared at it. The ranger switched it on. The battery was still good. Carol looked back across the water toward our campsite. A second radio somewhere on our side could have transmitted a voice through that one. From where Renee and I had been standing, it would have sounded exactly as though a person was calling from somewhere in the dark woods beyond the opposite bank. The man had not needed to be across the river. He only needed his voice to be. Renee looked at me. Someone could have been behind us the whole time. That thought stayed with me. One person could have been watching our campsite while speaking through another radio hidden across the river. When we moved toward the footbridge, we would have been walking away from the Bronco, away from the tent, and directly toward a narrow crossing surrounded by trees. Scout had stopped us before we made it halfway there. The rangers told us to start packing while they continued searching. We had almost finished loading the Bronco when Carol called us over. The other ranger had found something else. About 100 yards behind Site 14, beyond a shallow drainage cut, there was an old tree with a hollow opening near its base. Inside were spare batteries, 2 cans of food, a cheap flashlight, and a small spiral notebook sealed inside a plastic sandwich bag. Carol put on gloves before opening it. The first pages contained numbers. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. Then I recognized them, campsite numbers. Beside them were short descriptions written in pencil. Couple, solo, family, trailer, 2 men. Some entries had dates. Others had short notes about vehicles or dogs. Several site numbers had lines drawn through them. Renee moved closer. Carol turned another page. Near the bottom, written in darker pencil than most of the older entries, was 14. Man, woman, dog. Nobody spoke. It was us. There was another word written directly underneath. Bridge. That was all. Site 14. Man, woman, dog. Bridge. I asked Carol what the crossed out numbers meant. She looked down at the notebook. I don't know. It was the way she said it that bothered me, not dramatically, not like she was hiding some terrible secret. She genuinely did not know. I asked whether anything like this had happened before. Carol hesitated, then told us there had been 2 reports earlier that summer from campers who heard voices calling for help after dark. In both cases, the sound seemed to come from across water or down a ravine. Rangers searched the next morning and found nobody needing help. One of those groups returned to their campsite later and found a cooler and portable radio missing. Carol said it was possible someone had developed an elaborate way of drawing campers away from their belongings. Renee pointed toward the notebook. If he wanted our cooler, why write down that we had a dog? Carol did not answer. Renee touched the word on the page without actually putting her finger on it. And why write bridge? Again, no answer. That was what made the notebook worse than anything else we had found. If somebody only wanted to steal our camping equipment, nothing on that page explained why they were recording who was at each site, whether they were alone, whether they had a dog, or exactly which direction they wanted them to move. The rangers searched both sides of the river for several hours. They found more footprints in soft ground near the campsite, but nothing clear enough to identify anyone. Whoever had been there had left before daylight. We moved to the main campground that afternoon. It was crowded and noisy. Kids rode bicycles past our site. Somebody had a generator running. Car doors slammed every few minutes. And a family 2 sites over had a dog that barked at practically everyone. Normally, that kind of campground would have annoyed me. That night, every sound was comforting. Scout finally slept. Renee and I stayed awake beside the fire anyway. At some point, she looked at me and said, "If Scout hadn't stopped us, we would have crossed." I knew exactly what she meant. From our campsite to the footbridge was about 200 yards. Then we would have crossed the river. Then we would have followed the voice farther into the trees. Every step would have taken us farther from the Bronco, farther from other campers, farther from the only road out. And the entire time, whoever had been sitting behind our tent would have known exactly where we were going. The word in the notebook was not cooler. It was not radio. It was not supplies. It was bridge. We left the forest the next morning. Before we drove away, Carol made Renee a photocopy of the notebook page because Renee wanted something proving how specific the entry had been. I kept that copy for years. 14. Man, woman, dog, bridge. A few weeks later, Renee called the ranger station. No one had been identified. Patrols had been increased around the primitive sites, and as far as Carol knew, there had been no new reports of voices calling from the woods. Scout lived another 9 years. She became afraid of thunderstorms when she got older. She hated vacuum cleaners. Once she spent almost an hour barking at a plastic grocery bag caught in a hedge. But in all the years I had that dog, she only behaved the way she did at Site 14 once. That night, I can still remember the man's voice coming through the darkness. "Please hurry." For a long time I wondered what would have happened if Renee and I had ignored Scout and walked toward that footbridge. I stopped wondering years ago. Someone had already counted how many of us were there. Someone had noticed the dog. Someone had been sitting behind our campsite while we talked beside the fire. And before that voice ever called for help, they had already written down exactly where they wanted us to go.